Welcome to our Bible class at St. Jude's. I'm Larry Kavanagh, and thanks for clicking on this video. Today, we're talking about two prophets who often get confused with each other, probably because their names sound so similar, and also because one was a disciple of the other. To make things a little bit easier, maybe, I'm going to exaggerate my mispronunciation of their names. So it will be Elijah and Elisha. Enough said. Let's talk about Elijah first. He was the older prophet, and as you will see, Elisha was his disciple. There are many prophets, some very famous, some less famous, with wonderful Old Testament books named after them. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Baruch, Joel, Obadiah, Micah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Zechariah, plus a few others who are historians as well as prophets. But there is no book of Elijah. No book of Elijah? Yet, even in the New Testament, when Jesus was transfigured on a mountaintop in the company of Peter, James, and John, as recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, the two figures who appeared with Jesus were Moses and Elijah. And in other places, Jesus himself even personified his cousin, John the Baptist, as the return of Elijah to earth. Elijah was more a prophet of action than he was a prophet of meditation. He didn't write any psalms or compose any beautiful prayers. Instead, he was a man who simply did what the Lord wanted him to do, just like Moses. The legendary accomplishments of Elijah and Elisha are recorded in the 2 books of Kings, from 1 Kings chapter 17 through 2 Kings chapter 13. These give many more stories than I can fit into this short talk, and they make great reading. They're included in both the Catholic and the Protestant versions of the Old Testament, and the stories in both those books are the same. Now let's take a quick look first at the map of Israel and Judah, as it was back in those days. Under King David and his son King Solomon, the two kingdoms were united. But after Solomon's death, they split into separate kingdoms with separate kings. The history of those two kingdoms for the next few hundred years was like a seesaw. First, one of the kingdoms would have a ruler who worshiped Yahweh, and the other would have a ruler who worshiped multiple false gods, and most often the god Baal. Next, rulers would switch, move on, and the kingdom worshiping Baal would get back on track to worship Yahweh, while the other kingdom slipped into idolatry and started worshiping Baal. And that's the way it worked for a couple of hundred years. The map here also shows some neighboring kingdoms, notably Aram and Moab, which figure into some of the things we'll be talking about later. In modern times, Aram is now mainly part of the territory of Lebanon, and Moab is mainly part of Jordan and Syria. During the time that Elijah was active, which was about 50 years after the death of Solomon, the king of Israel then was Ahab, and his wife was the notorious Jezebel. They were fierce worshippers of Baal and another god named Asherah. Israel is where Elijah was born and where he spent most of his earthly life. Under the direction of Yahweh, Elijah performed many impossible deeds in Israel, much to the consternation of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. At Yahweh's command, he created a drought in Israel, and at Yahweh's command, he ended the drought. During the drought, at the beckoning of the Lord, He first hid in a place east of the Jordan and was fed by ravens who brought him bread and meat. Later in the drought, he lived in the city of Zarephath, where he was fed by a widow who had only a meager supply of flour and a small amount of oil. That little bit of nourishment was all she had to feed herself and her son, and now also to feed Elijah. Nevertheless, miraculously, the food never ran out, and she had enough to feed them for a long time. Sometime after Elijah began eating at this widow's table, the widow's son fell ill and died. But Elijah prayed to the Lord, and the Lord returned life to the widow's son. When Elijah carried the boy to his mother, she exclaimed, "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Sounds like a forecast of something that Jesus would do. Remember the story in Matthew about Jesus reviving the life of the official's daughter? The most public achievement of Elijah happened on Mount Carmel. At the risk of his life, he daringly appeared before King Ahab to declare that only Yahweh was God and that Baal was no god and had no place in Israel. As a demonstration, he challenged Ahab to call all of Israel to assemble, together with 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah that Jezebel herself was housing and feeding in the palace household. 850. He dared them to ask their God to bring down fire to cook a fatted bull, which would be offered for sacrifice to them. Elijah said that he could stand alone and ask Yahweh to send down fire on a second bull, which he would place on an altar to Yahweh. Well, the priests of Baal and Asherah accepted the challenge. They chanted to their idol all day long, but Baal produced no fire. Their fatted bull was still raw after they had done their best, even tearing their garments in exasperation. Elijah succeeded in dramatic fashion. He had his helpers pour buckets of water on his own fatted bull and all around the altar they had set up. How could he get a fire going with all that water? But he did. Yahweh sent down enormous flames on the sacrifice, and it was barbecued splendidly. Ahab was humiliated. The miraculous fire from Yahweh caused the assembled crowds of people to shout that Yahweh is God, and Ahab had no answer. The huge crowd descended on the failed prophets of the false god, and, led by Elijah, all 850 of those prophets were slaughtered. This demonstration of Yahweh's power is the miracle most remembered from Mount Carmel. It even reminds me of the high school that my two sisters attended in New Orleans, Mount Carmel Academy, very famous place. The slaughter of the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah is described in this way in the first book of Kings. Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." Then they seized them, and Elijah brought them down into the Wadi Kishon and killed them there. That seems to say that Elijah personally killed each and every one of those false god prophets. That's a large task for one person. Presumably he had help from the crowd. If there was any doubt about the difference between the prophet Elijah, who doesn't have a book named after him, and the prophet Isaiah, who does have a book named after him, it might be clear from this incident. Isaiah prophesied about turning swords into plowshares. Elijah had no hesitation with swords. However, the fury of the crowd did not grow into a general rebellion, and Baal remained the only god for Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel was particularly outraged. she sent Elijah a note, which said in part, "May the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of those prophets by this time tomorrow." Well, after receiving that note, Elijah spent a short time hiding out in Judah, across the border. But he was back shortly and performed many other miracles in Israel, much to the consternation of King Ahab and his son Ahaziah, but not leading to their conversion. The way Elijah departed his earthly life is the event that is most remembered, although it was not as public as the slaughter of the 850 false prophets. It's told charmingly in chapter 2 of the second book of Kings. It comes after Elijah had already acquired his hand-picked successor, the prophet Elisha. As the two of them were walking, Elijah told Elisha to stay where he was because the Lord wanted him in Bethel. Elisha refused to leave his master, so they went to Bethel, where Elisha admitted to some of Yahweh's followers there that he knew this was the day when the Lord would take his master. They continued journeying to Jericho, where Elisha also admitted to others that this was the day that Elijah would depart. Again, Elisha refused to leave Elijah, and 50 other prophets followed them at a distance. When they reached the Jordan, Elijah touched part of his cloak to the water, and the river divided, leaving them a dry path to cross. Elijah asked Elisha if he had any request before the Lord took him away. Elisha asked for a double portion of your spirit. Then a fiery chariot appeared, drawn by fiery horses, and Elijah was taken away to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha tore his own garment, picked up Elijah's mantle which had fallen, and walked back to the bank of the river. When he touched the mantle to the water, it parted, and he returned to the other shore, where the 50 followers were waiting. When they saw him, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests upon Elisha." Elisha was the only witness to the chariot of fire that carried Elijah to heaven. But a 3-day search by the 50 prophets who had followed them revealed no trace of Elijah. So it was concluded that he had been taken directly into heaven. Elijah is the only person in the Bible, Old or New Testaments, to have been taken up to heaven without dying first. Even in our modern times today, during the annual feast of Passover, when Jewish families sit down at table for their Seder, it is a tradition to leave an empty chair, or at least to have poured an extra cup of wine with an extra setting. This wine is for Elijah, in readiness for him if he returns. The departure by Elijah left Elisha as his successor, and this new man of God in Israel. Elisha performed numerous miracles. Most of them were spectacular demonstrations of love for the followers of the Lord and for his fellow human beings. However, one early event was surprisingly stirring. That one came as Elisha was walking towards Bethel shortly after Elijah had been charioted away. A group of 42 young boys saw him on the road, and they taunted, go away, bald head." Elisha cursed the group of boys in the name of the Lord. And immediately thereafter, 2 she-bears came out of the woods, and they attacked and mauled the boys. Seems harsh, but the Lord works in mysterious ways. Many miracles surrounding Elisha of a more charming sort are recorded in chapters 4 to 8 of 2 Kings. There are almost too many to count, so I can't tell them all. One of them involves a woman whose husband had just recently died, and he left her with 2 children and many large debts. Her creditors were coming after her and were planning to sell the 2 children into slavery to pay off what she owed. She told Elisha that she had nothing in her house except a jug of oil. Elisha told her, "Get that jug of oil and borrow as many containers as you can get from your friends and neighbors." He told her to fill all the containers with the oil from her jug and then set each container aside as it became full. Well, when the widow had filled all the containers with oil, she had so much oil to sell that she could pay off all her debts, and she had enough left over to maintain her whole household. How about that? Another story about Elisha. A man came to Elisha while he was preaching and brought him 20 freshly baked barley loaves. Elisha told him, "Give them to the people to eat." At the time, there were about 100 people listening to Elisha, and they were all hungry. Elisha told the man, "Thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." Elisha was so correct. Everyone was fed, and there was plenty left over. Does this sound like the forerunner of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish? Yet another story about Elisha. There was a wealthy woman in Shunem, which was a place that Elisha passed through frequently. Every time he passed through her town, since she knew he was a man of God, she pressed him to dine with her and her husband. Elisha and his servant Gehazi dined there frequently, so much so that the woman had a room built on the roof of her house where Elisha could stay when he was passing through in town. Elisha was so charmed by her hospitality that he asked her if there was something he could do for her in return. Well, she told Elisha's servant Gehazi that she was sad because she had no children and her husband was growing old. Elisha called her and told her that in a year she would be cradling a baby son. And so it happened. Another miracle. Does this remind you of Abraham and Sarah having the child Isaac in their old age? Or of Zechariah and Elizabeth having the child John the Baptist? But there's actually more to the story of that baby, the son of the rich woman. As he grew up, the boy was working in the field with his father during harvest time, and he suddenly developed a severe headache. His father had him taken to his mother, and he died in her arms. When Elisha was told of this, he gave his staff to his servant Gehazi and told him, "Go to the boy and touch him with the staff." Then Elisha visited the dead boy himself. Elisha looked at the dead child, touched his mouth, touched his eyes, held his hands, lay on him, and he felt the warmth returning. The boy lived, and Elisha gave him back to his mother. A forecast of Lazarus rising from the dead? Wait a minute, hold it. In the Bible accounts about Elijah, we heard a story about the child of a widow dying, and with Elijah's touch, the Lord returned the boy to life. Is this the same story? Did the authors of the books of Kings get their facts mixed up, and there was really just one boy who was brought back to life, and we're not sure whether it was Elijah or Elisha who did it? Nope. These are 2 separate stories. Elijah prayed to the Lord over the dead son of a poor widow who had been living hand to mouth with oil from a tiny jug. Elisha presided over the resurrection of a different boy who was the son of a wealthy woman who, with her husband, had built an extra room on her roof for Elisha and his servant to stay whenever they passed through her town. They're two different stories. Actually, this is not the only story about resurrection from the dead involving Elisha. There's another one. I'm going to save it for the end of this talk. There are really too many good stories to tell in one talk, as I've said, but just one more involving the kingdom of Aram is especially good. On one occasion, it happened that the commander of the army of Aram, whose name was Naaman, had leprosy, and he badly wished for a cure. A young girl who had been captured in a raid by the Arameans in Israel had told her new masters that there was a wonderful prophet in Samaria, which is part of Israel, who could cure him. Hearing this, the king of Aram told Naaman that he would write a letter and send gifts to the king of Israel and ask him to cure his commander. He sent 10 silver talents, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 festal garments along with his letter. By this time, the kingdom of Israel had swung back to the worship of Yahweh, by the way, and their king was probably Jehu, who was on very good terms with Elisha. When Jehu, the king, received this note from the Aramean king, he was dumbfounded, but he sent Commander Naaman to Elisha. When Naaman arrived at Elisha's place, Elisha would not even get out of his house. Instead, Elisha sent him a message. Go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored. Naaman was actually insulted. With all the valuable things he was bringing, this prophet would not even come out of his house to meet him? And he told him to bathe in the Jordan? Aren't the rivers of Aram better and cleaner than the Jordan? Nevertheless, Naaman's servants calmed him down and convinced him to do what Elisha had said. Naaman washed himself 7 times in the Jordan, and his leprosy was cured. A miracle indeed. Naaman returned to Elisha's house and told him, Now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. He offered Elisha his gifts. Elisha declined the gifts, but Naaman requested the privilege of taking back 2 mule loads of earth from Elisha's house, which he would use in Aram as ground upon which to make sacrifices to the Lord Yahweh. Elisha's servant Gehazi was not as generous as Elisha in dismissing Naaman without receiving a gift. Gehazi chased after Naaman's caravan and asked for and received 2 talents of silver and 2 festal garments. Elisha chided him for his greed, and as punishment caused the same leprosy to cling to Gehazi and his descendants. One final story about Elisha. After Elisha had died, a band of Moabites cast a dead man into the grave of Elisha, and after contact with Elisha's bones, this dead man also returned to life. Yet another predecessor to the New Testament story of Jesus restoring Lazarus from the dead. So much for this short story of the amazing achievements of Elijah and Elisha. There are so many more in the books of Kings. Many of these, plus lesser-known stories about other biblical persons, are also retold in the book which I've written, titled Murder, Adultery, and Betrayal in the Old Testament, published by Amazon and available in Kindle and print editions from the Amazon website. Thanks so much for watching and listening, and have a blessed day.